France and Britain so became sponsors of the State of Israel in the 1950s, mainly because they valued Israel as a tool for crushing Arab nationalism. The Arab nationalism of Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had nationalized the Suez Canal, which had been British and French owned, and was backing movements of Arabs to free themselves from the grips of British and French colonialism. Well, since 1967, the United States, the greatest imperialist power in history, has used Israel in exactly the manner Herzl intended, as a battering ram to knock down all resistance to the domination of the Middle East by the West. Now, I have a commitment to a theory of foreign policy. Oh, maybe this is, you talked the Gaونز thesis, or the Parenti thesis, really. And my commitment is that the foreign policy decisions of states ultimately reflect the way in which their economies are organized. And in the case of the United States, that means that Washington's foreign policy is traceable to imperatives in its capitalist economy to incessantly expand its economic and political and ideological frontiers. Or as I put it in my book, dominating the Middle East has always been an outcome of a compulsion that has chased US investors over the entire surface of the globe to nestle everywhere, to settle everywhere, to establish connections everywhere. And that is the compulsion of profit making. So the continual drive of capitalism to conquer new markets and secure new investment opportunities creates two sets of conflicts. First, there's a conflict between competing states for the same profit-making opportunities. And second, there's a conflict arising in the resistance of people who live on the territory whose frontiers are being violated by the expanding states in search of markets and investment opportunities for their dominant class. Kind of to illustrate this, let me give you an idea of what Woodrow Wilson once said. Woodrow Wilson was the US president immediately before and during World War I. This is what he said. He was also an academic. He was giving a lecture at Columbia University. Here's what he said. Since trade ignores national boundaries and manufacturers insist on having the world as a market, the flag of his nation must follow him. And the doors of the nations which are closed must be battered down. Concessions obtained by financiers must be safeguarded by ministers of state, even if the sovereignty of unwilling nations be outraged in the process. No useful corner of the world may be overlooked or left unused. The US foreign policy has long followed this Wilsonian point of view. US investors and business people cannot be denied any of the profit-making opportunities that arise anywhere in the world. That is the function of the US state, to ensure that those people have access to every profit-making opportunity that is available, and on terms that are at least as good as those available in the United States. So apropos of this, you might want to know that the US State Department complained about the failure of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to dismantle what it called his Soviet economic model, which limited US profit-making opportunities in Syria. And they complained about his refusal to reform his economy to fully open it to US exports and investments. You might also want to know that Washington considers Iran's economy to be insufficiently accommodating of US trade and investment. This is also true of Libya's economy and Arab nationalist Iraq's economy, and remains true of North Korea's and Venezuela's and China's and Cuba's.
You forgot to mention the big one, Russia.
Yeah. So if the sovereignty of unwilling nations is outraged in the process of battering down their doors, it's predictable that a resistance will very likely arise. Well, so Israel, as I pointed out, was envisaged by the political Zionists as an instrument that would be used by a patron empire to quell the resistance of the people in the Middle East to outrages against their sovereignty. So this was the essential quid pro quo that Herzl had offered in empire. In return for sponsorship of a large power, a Jewish state in Palestine as an extension of the West would suppress the resistance of the natives to the expansion of the economic frontiers of the Jewish state's imperialist sponsor. So essentially, the Zionist Jews were renting themselves out as muscle for whatever empire would back their solution to anti-Semitism. So Herzl said the Jewish state would be a link in Europe's rampart against Asia and an outpost of civilization against barbarism. Moshe Dayan, who held several key posts in the Israeli government, is reputed to have said that the Jewish people has a mission, especially in its Israeli branch. In this part of the world, it has to be a rock, an extension of the West against which the waves of Arab nationalism will be broken. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's current prime minister, has in this tradition acknowledged that Israel is, quote, the West's outpost in the Middle East. Now you may have noticed that Western news media often refer to Israel as a Western nation, even though it's located in the East. Well, that's implicit recognition of Israel as a Western outpost in the East. Leaders of the resistance to the expansion of Western economic, political, and ideological frontiers in the Middle East have seen the role of Israel in exactly the same light. Saddam Hussein, the Arab nationalist leader of Iraq, called Israel a club the United States uses against the Arabs. Gamal Abdel Nasser, whose name at one time was synonymous with Arab nationalism. If you're an Arab nationalist, you called yourself a Nasserist. He described Israel as a poisoned dagger implanted by the West in the heart of the Arab nation. Leila Hadid, the Palestinian revolutionary, called Israel America and Europe combined in Palestine. Syed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of the Lebanese resistance organization Hezbollah, says that the United States wants the Middle East to be under its political, military, security, economic, and cultural domination, and that Washington uses Israel as the tool to promote this agenda.